Have you ever tried to confront someone about something they did and somehow ended up apologizing? You started the conversation with a clear point. You knew what happened. You knew what they said. You knew why it hurt you. But a few minutes later, the entire conversation had changed. Now you were the one defending yourself. They weren't explaining their behavior. They weren't taking responsibility. Instead, they were explaining how you hurt them, and suddenly they were the victim. This is one of the most powerful psychological manipulation tactics because once someone convinces others that they are the victim, every word you say begins to sound like an attack. Most people imagine manipulation as something obvious. They picture aggressive behavior, yelling, threats, or controlling language. But the most effective manipulators rarely behave that way. In fact, the most skilled manipulators often appear calm, reasonable, and misunderstood. They don't try to dominate conversations. They reshape them. They don't try to control people through force. They control the story. And one of the most effective ways they do this is by playing the victim. In this video, we are going to explore why manipulators use this tactic, how it works psychologically, and why it is so effective at confusing people. 1. Human empathy. The reason this tactic works begins with something very human: empathy. Human beings are naturally wired to respond to suffering. When we see someone who appears hurt, attacked, or misunderstood, we instinctively want to help them. We want to comfort them. We want to be fair. We want to avoid causing harm. This instinct is essential for healthy relationships. But manipulators understand something very important about empathy. It can be exploited. Instead of defending their behavior, manipulators trigger your empathy. They make you feel like you have done something wrong simply by confronting them. Once empathy enters the conversation, logic often disappears. The focus moves away from the original issue and toward the manipulator's feelings. 2. Shifting the conversation. Imagine confronting someone about lying to you. A direct response might include explanation or accountability, but manipulators rarely do that. Instead, they respond with something like, "Why are you always accusing me?" Or, "I can't believe you think so badly of me." Now something important has happened. The topic has changed. The conversation is no longer about the lie. It is about your accusation. Instead of explaining their behavior, the manipulator has shifted the conversation toward your tone, your intentions, or your trust. This tactic creates confusion, and confusion makes manipulation easier. 3. Social perception. Playing the victim becomes even more powerful in social situations. People naturally want to support those who appear to be suffering. If someone presents themselves as the injured party, others often rally around them. Manipulators understand this. They often tell their version of the story first. They describe how they were hurt, how they were misunderstood, how someone treated them unfairly. But they leave out key details, the details that would reveal their own responsibility. By the time others hear the full story, the emotional narrative has already been shaped. And once people emotionally invest in defending someone, they become less willing to question them for confusion. One of the most damaging effects of this tactic is confusion. When someone repeatedly portrays themselves as the victim, the people around them begin questioning their own perception. You might start asking yourself, was I too harsh? Did I misunderstand what happened? Maybe I should have handled that differently. Over time, this doubt grows. Instead of trusting your own experience, you begin adjusting your behavior to avoid upsetting the manipulator. And that shift gives the manipulator something extremely powerful: control, because once you begin walking on eggshells, they control the emotional environment. 5. The DARVO pattern. Psychologists often describe this manipulation using a pattern called DARVO. DARVO stands for deny, attack, reverse, victim, and offender. First, the manipulator denies the behavior. Then they attack the person confronting them. Finally, they reverse the roles, presenting themselves as the victim. At the end of the interaction, the person who raised the concern appears aggressive, and the manipulator appears hurt. This pattern can happen very quickly. So quickly that people don't notice it in real time. But once you recognize it, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. 6. Why manipulators keep doing this. Manipulators continue using this tactic because it works. If playing the victim allows them to avoid consequences, avoid responsibility, and gain sympathy from others, there is no reason to stop. Over time, the behavior becomes a habit. Sometimes it becomes automatic. Not every manipulator consciously plans every step, but they have learned something powerful. Presenting themselves as the injured party gives them emotional leverage, and emotional leverage often wins arguments. 7. Recognizing the pattern. Recognizing this manipulation begins with observing patterns. Pay attention to how conflicts unfold. Do conversations consistently end with the same reversal? You raise a concern, they become the victim. You try to explain yourself, and somehow you end up apologizing. When this pattern repeats again and again, it is no longer a misunderstanding, it is a strategy. And recognizing that strategy is the first step toward protecting yourself from it. The emotional trap. Another reason manipulators play the victim is because it creates an emotional trap. When someone appears hurt, our first instinct is rarely to question them. Instead, we want to repair the situation. We want to calm them down. We want to prove that we are not the kind of person who would intentionally cause harm. Manipulators understand this instinct extremely well. So instead of discussing the issue directly, they focus on how deeply the situation affected them. They might say things like, "I can't believe you would think that about me," or "I feel like you don't trust me at all." These statements are powerful because they move the conversation away from facts and toward emotions. Once emotions dominate, the original issue often disappears. Now the discussion becomes about repairing the manipulator's feelings rather than addressing their behavior. And when the conversation reaches that point, the manipulator has already succeeded, because accountability has been replaced with sympathy. How manipulators build support. Manipulators rarely rely on a single conversation. Instead, they slowly shape the perception of the people around them. Sometimes they talk to friends, family members, or co-workers. They describe situations where they were misunderstood. They emphasized how much they tried to do the right thing, and they suggest that someone else is being unfair or overly critical. What they rarely do is present the entire story. Important details disappear. The manipulator focuses only on the parts that make them appear sympathetic. Over time, this creates a powerful advantage, because when a conflict eventually becomes visible, many people have already formed an opinion. They have already heard the manipulator's version of events, and human beings naturally trust the story they heard first. So when someone finally challenges the manipulator, the reaction from others can be surprising. Instead of asking questions, they may defend the manipulator, not because they know the truth, but because the emotional narrative has already been established. The long-term effect. Over time, this pattern can have a serious psychological impact on people. Constant blame shifting creates self-doubt. The person confronting the manipulator may begin questioning their own judgment. They may wonder if they misunderstood the situation. They may even start apologizing for things that were not their fault. This gradual erosion of confidence makes manipulation easier, because the more uncertain someone feels about their own perception, the more influence the manipulator gains. Eventually, some people stop raising concerns altogether. They avoid difficult conversations, they avoid conflict. They simply accept the manipulator's version of reality to keep the peace. But that peace is fragile, because the underlying problem was never addressed. And when manipulation goes unchallenged, the pattern tends to repeat itself again and again. The moment of realization. The turning point usually comes when someone finally notices the pattern. They realize that every disagreement follows the same structure. They raise a concern. The manipulator becomes the victim. The conversation shifts away from the issue, and somehow responsibility disappears. Once this pattern becomes clear, the confusion begins to fade, because manipulation depends heavily on uncertainty. It depends on people doubting their own experience. But when the pattern becomes visible, the story loses its power. The manipulator can still attempt the same tactics, but the emotional effect is no longer the same. Instead of feeling guilty or confused, the person begins to recognize the strategy, and recognition is the first step toward breaking the cycle. Playing the victim is one of the most subtle forms of manipulation. It does not rely on threats. It does not rely on intimidation. Instead, it relies on empathy. It relies on social perception, and it relies on confusion. But once you recognize the pattern, the tactic begins to lose its power, because manipulation depends on controlling the story. And the moment you see the story clearly, it becomes much harder to rewrite.